My talk today is on birds and community science. And one of the things which I was really excited about was to be able to talk about the opportunities of how things people do as bird watchers really are relevant and answers bigger questions about the ecology of cities and addressing conservation issues and a whole range of topics like that. So to start out, I'm going to talk about what citizen science is and what community science is and why those terms are sometimes used interchangeably. And this is a picture from the Los Angeles County Museum, Los Angeles, California. And they have a program called the Urban Nature Research Center. I just really like this picture because it captures what sort of how things that people are passionate about as far as nature, how those things really can plug in to understanding more about what species occur in cities, to helping plan conservation efforts in cities, and to try to really just engage people in nature in cities. So this picture I thought was great. It's the probably most un-Kansas City-like picture you could think of in terms of sort of the setting. But what it really captures is you have in the background a whole bunch of people who seem very, very excited about what this gentleman from the museum is showing on his laptop. And what he's sharing are some data that he's collected. And I think from the way that it looks in the picture of this frame, they must be looking at something that's being projected on the screen. And but the idea behind the citizen science is really engaging people in nature and getting people to think about how they can use their knowledge and their interest to contribute to more about what we know about species and cities. So the Los Angeles County Museum has talked about this a lot, and I like their definition of what they say about community science and citizen science. They say that first, they want to engage people in the process of science. So in other words, the idea behind citizen science is to capture people's interest and also their knowledge and use that to help enhance the kind of work that scientists do when they're studying nature. And what they're really interested in often with citizen science is accessing places that are difficult to study. In other words, they know that, for example, bird watchers go all kinds of places to see birds. We'll talk about that in a second. And they know these are places typically that scientists don't often go or don't get to. And they also know that these kinds of places are ones where they can really build on the knowledge that people have. In other words, most people who belong to, say, Burroughs Audubon probably are much better birders than most scientists are. They know species, they're passionate about it, so they really contribute a lot. And then finally, though, the LA County Museum talks about something a little bit different, and they talk about why they use the term community science. They say that they want to explicitly engage people who are from communities that often may not be served by conservation agencies, by scientists, as well as they should be. They want to engage diverse communities of people, and they want to explicitly make it clear that the important part is being engaged in a community of people studying something and not so much engaging as a citizen, and particularly in California, where issues about citizenship and belonging are a little bit different. So they really wanted to stress this idea that they want to engage all kinds of people in this practice of understanding what kinds of species occur in their community. So we're talking about what community science is. Let's talk about what birds and why to study birds. And birds, I like to think about, are a window of looking at nature. They're a way of how people can look at nature wherever they live. And they're a way that are relatively easy to learn so that people can be engaged early in life and continue that interest over time. So these are two different pictures that I hope offer a really different kind of look at why birds are important. The picture on the left, which unfortunately is really pixelated and grainy, unfortunately, is a picture of a project I've been involved with for about 20 years called the Baltimore Ecosystem Study. And in that project, we have a sub-project that's called Birds in Everyday Baltimore. And that project is focusing on doing a systematic counting of birds in Baltimore on 130 birds, on 132 bird census points around the city. So we've had data there that goes back to about 2002. and we know what species occur across the city. And one of the points is actually on the street that is perpendicular to Franklin Square Middle School in Baltimore. So one of the outreach projects that this largest study has done was working with kids in the program called Green Career Ladder to get them interested in what kinds of species occur in Baltimore, everything from trees to birds to fishes to the whole range of things, and how to conserve them. And so for several years, I was involved along several other grad students to go to Franklin Square and get them thinking about birds again as a way of thinking about the birds in the neighborhood. So this is a neighborhood in Baltimore, and these are kids who live in that neighborhood. On the right, we see what many of us think of as a much more typical sort of scene of how you're introduced to nature through a nature center. So this is a nature center. I believe this is also in Baltimore, but I'm not sure because one of my grad students took this picture, but this is a picture, again, of people looking out a window at a nature center, looking at birds, and you see they have a field, they have a sheet with the birds on it, and they're pointing. And so I like these two pictures because they show very different looks at how people doing the same activity in very different groups of people, recognizing that birds are a window to nature for all kinds of people in all kinds of places. And we're going to talk about birds in cities. So what we know about birds and birding in cities are some interesting kinds of things. For several years, I've been involved with a project looking at biodiversity of birds around the world. And so this started out with a study looking at birds and plants in 147 cities around the world. And there are, I think, 54 cities on here where we have data about birds. So what's important in looking at this graph, and it got cut off at the bottom, but what I want you really to think about as you look at this is that we looked at the proportion of plant species that were, and bird species that were native and the proportion that were non-native. And we looked at this in terms of overall number of species around the world. And so what shows up in here are first that the colors represent different regions of the world. So for example, the green is the portion of North America that's north of North and Central America and South America. That sort of blue colors is Sub-Saharan Africa. Pink is sort of Indo-Malaysia region. So these are sort of biogeographic regions of the world. And what we're showing on the graph on the right, where we talk about birds, this just simply shows the number of different bird species that occurred in in cities in these different regions. So what you see on here is what you'd expect, that the tropics and subtropics, like the sort of Sub-Saharan Africa, sort of area around Indonesia, India, Malaysia, that sort of Indian subcontinent region, those are the places that have lots of bird species compared to other regions around the world. But those also show those same patterns in cities. And what's kind of nice on here that you can't see is if you look on the left at the plants, you see that there are lots of non-native plant species in cities. In other words, those exotic species are kind of creeping up into view. But what's really cool about birds in cities is that if you think about it, about the total number of species in cities, non-native species are a very, very small part of what we see in cities as far as birds. So this is the first thing that really is important. People think about birds, they say, oh, all this there are pigeons, starlings, and house sparrows. And that may be true in the number of individuals you see, but the number of species you see is really not true. In most cities in North America, there are only usually 3 or 4 non-native species of birds that occur in the cities. So cities, first of all, capture a lot of native bird species. Next, people often say, you know, if you go from city to city to city, you see the same birds everywhere. In fact, cities are homogenized. They're all identical in terms of birds. And again, we found that's not really true. So this shows a graph showing the relationships between the cities to each other based on what bird species occur in that city. And what this shows is not true is that cities are all alike in terms of what species are there. And so if you look on the left-hand side of the figure, which are the North American cities that we had. So we're seeing on the left, we're seeing Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Ottawa, Ontario, Morelia, Mexico, Mexico City, Mexico, Querétaro, Mexico, Fresno and Tucson in Arizona, Seattle, Washington, and Vancouver, British Columbia. Those are the North American cities where we had data. And if you look at those, first of all, those form their own group. And if you look at how those sort of are clustered in groups, you see that the East Coast cities, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Ottawa occur together. The Mexican cities, Morelia, Mexico City, and Querétaro, which all are sort of in the central part of Mexico, occur together. Fresno and Tucson in the Southwest occur together, and the two Pacific Northwest cities occur together. And what that means is that the species in those cities are similar to each other, but they're different from the other cities that are grouped together. So what this whole graph tells us is that the North American birds are distinct from birds, say, in African cities, which are next to them. They're distinct from the birds in Australia and New Zealand. And then they're distinct from a lot of the bird species that occur primarily in the European cities. And then finally, on the right-hand side of the graph, we could talk about birds in India and sort of China and the Indian subcontinent. And then finally, over at the right, we have the South American cities. So this is just saying what might seem obvious to people who live in cities. So they see different kinds of birds. But what's really important in here, it kind of tells scientists, reminds scientists that cities are really interesting places. They have unique species of birds and different combinations of bird species, which are important to study. And then finally, for the folks who are birders, we have a trivia question. I'm going to ask this question, ask you to type your answers into the chat. And I should have done this before I put the slide up, but the question is, which families of birds do you think are the best represented in cities? When I say best represented, that means if you go to a city anywhere on Earth, which groups of bird species do you think would be the best represented? Which families of birds would be the best represented? So let's write down what your guess would be. And then what the ones that are best represented are, from left to right, the accipiters, which are basically the hawks and buzzards and eagles and those kinds of birds. Next would be waterfowl, and particularly ducks, geese, and swans. And then third most best represented family would be the shorebirds. So we found that, for example, these pictures here, we have a red-tailed hawk. We have a common pochard, which is a species that's primarily a European species. And then we have killdeer. But these three groups were surprisingly the best represented. So they bring up a point that's really interesting about cities, about what makes cities attractive places for birds. Why is it different bird species occur in cities? And why are these families well represented? And what people think on these are that first, that cities capture a lot of the structural features and habitat features that different groups of species like, and that for these three groups, for the accipiters, for the ducks, geese, and swans, and for shorebirds, they provide things like water, they provide a lot of vertical structure, they provide environments that have lots of nesting resources and food resources. So these particular families of birds do really, really well in cities globally. So with that kind of setup about what we know about birds in cities, let's talk a little bit more now about some ideas about what we know about citizen science projects that are going. And before we get there, I left my one last slide. I apologize. That the other thing we need to know, though, that explains about why those different families might be well represented in cities, are that cities filter birds. So if you think about a regional species pool those get filtered down into different locations in cities. So if you think about the area around Kansas City and around Missouri, in general, you're seeing this kind of grouping of these different kinds of places. Now, this is a map that EPA put together, which actually shows these places in the different colors represent what are called major land resource areas, which relate to there's an agriculture and different kinds of land use and so on. But the key part you see is if you look at the Kansas City area, you see it's kind of an intersection between sort of the prairie kind of areas, large ag areas, a little bit of the Ozarks, and also influenced a lot by the Missouri River. So you see these kind of things come together. And so that would suggest that probably you're going to get a lot of species in the region which are unique to these different habitats, and these kind of come together all in Kansas City, around Kansas City. And then you might think about, now I have a different map to show this, but if you think about those species, which could occur potentially because they occur across these range of different kinds of habitats, you could think about a city, like in this case, Columbia on the upper right, and you think about, okay, in Columbia, there are a whole range of topographic features, different kinds of habitats, different kinds of land uses, all of which are going to influence what species you actually see in the city as a whole. And then if you go down to, say, where you live, particular location in Kansas City or in Columbia, you would say again that there are additional factors. There's what you plant, what your neighbors plant, what kinds of things are around your neighborhood, who lives there, the kind of practices they do in their yard. All these different kinds of things are going to shape what bird species you actually see on your block. So this idea that you have this sort of regional pool of species which might occur across several states, and then you have those are filtered by whatever happens in a particular city, and then finally you get down to what you say the location. All those things are going to influence what birds you actually see when you go out to look at birds. And that's going to be important now as we think about the idea of actually birding and what bird watching contributes to citizen science. So we're going to talk about a particular citizen science project, which is called eBird. And there are two big online citizen science projects. One's called iNaturalist and one is called eBird. And we're going to talk about eBird because it focuses on birds. But eBird is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's designed to be a platform for sort of capturing all kinds of citizen science data. They have a sort of they have a backyard birding program. They have a feeder watch program. And then eBird is designed to really be the platform for people who are going out and counting birds in different places to record what they see. So essentially you can go onto this site, you can record a day's worth of observations, and you can develop checklists for different sites, whole range of things. And these data are arranged by location and what they call bird hotspots, but they also are available for geographic areas. So if you think about Kansas City and eBird, we're going to take sort of the core counties that make up the Kansas City region. So we have Jackson County and Clay County in Missouri, and Wyandotte and Johnson County in Kansas. And if you look at these, you see some interesting patterns. First of all, you see that there are 3 counties where there are almost identical numbers of species, Jackson, Clay, and Johnson, and one where there appear to be fewer species. But then you see some other patterns. You see that if you look at the number of what eBird calls eBirders, that is people are actually uploading data, you see that Jackson County and Johnson County have a relatively large number of people going out compiling data, collecting data. And then Clay has fewer, and then Wyandotte has the fewest. And so there are a lot of questions about why those patterns might be the way they are. But you might think from looking at the way these data are presented that perhaps there are fewer species in Wyandotte County that are recorded because there are fewer people out recording them. You might think maybe that with Jackson and Johnson, probably that you may see the highest number of species maybe because there are more people out birding. And then you get to Clay County and you might think, okay, maybe it's a combination of number of birders, maybe people are going to different places and so on. So This just is what the data look like, just from what's on the eBird page about people bird watching in the region. Then let's look at the hotspots. We're just going to look at just the hotspots in two different places. On the left are the hotspots in Jackson County, and on the right are the ones in Wyandotte County. And this may give you an idea of why some of the data look the way they do for these four counties. So the top spots in terms of place where people go in Jackson County are Longview Lake, Lake Jacomo, Blue Springs Lake, Legacy Park, and Jerry Smith Park. Then in Wyandotte County, they are Wyandotte County Lake, Caw Point Park, which is on the Kansas River, Lone Star Woods, Martineck Lane Woods, and the Kansas River access near Shawnee Mission on the Wyandotte County side. So what you're seeing is that most people who go birding in Kansas City and record their observations on eBird are going to the same place with these hotspots. And these are hotspots because you see lots of different species there. So one thing to be aware of with looking at eBird data is that it represents a subset of birders who record their data on eBird. It also represents a subset of places where people are going to look at birds. And so that comes in now with some research that's been done by a woman named Deja Perkins. And Deja is a recent graduate of North Carolina State University in the Fisheries and Wildlife program. She's from Chicago, and which is why she has the White Sox jersey on, or the White Sox t-shirt on. But what she did on her research is she compared eBird data to data that's been collected in systematic bird counts from 3 different cities. And she looked at Fresno, California, I believe Phoenix, Arizona, and then Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina. And I may have one of those messed up, but she looked at those 3 cities. And what she was interested in were differences in terms of what species were observed, what species are sort of reported on the eBird website for those cities, and what people found on the systematic counts. So what she found in general was there were some differences in species composition, that there were actually more species recorded on the systematic counts that were done. And she thought that this represents a couple things. First, it represents that obviously most people recording an eBird are going to places where they know they're going to see a lot of different species. But it also reflects where people don't go to go birding. And what she found was that some of these places are in neighborhoods that are maybe viewed as less desirable. There are places that people often view maybe as not being safe, and so on. So that some of what is being missed by birders who record an eBird are these kinds of places. So we're going to talk just for a little bit about what you actually see in some of these more systematic surveys. We're going to introduce you to 2 people who were grad students at MU, so that's why the actual studies they're reporting are in Columbia and in St. Louis. But first, Eric Fischel, who got his master's degree and now is actually running a nonprofit in Baltimore, Maryland, and working on trying to develop a sort of citizen-based birding project in Baltimore. Did his research looking at birds across Columbia, and his bird points are stratified by socioeconomic data. So the points that he looked at were trying to represent Columbia in terms of who lives where. So in this case, his points are stratified primarily by being a black resident of Columbia or not a black resident, by income, by level of education, and by home ownership. So those are the 3 big sort of variables that entered into here. So you're seeing where his points were, and what you're also seeing is if you look at sort of the center of the picture and where you see Providence Road, which is right in the middle, going north to south, and I-70, divides Colombia up into sort of 4 sections, and the southwest section of Colombia is the wealthiest section. The northeast section tends to be the poorest section. And then there's some differences in terms of things like home ownership. So for example, the west side of Colombia has a much higher proportion of home ownership, and the southwest side again tends to be much whiter. So these are just some patterns in Colombia. So what Eric did was he did a survey of these 100 bird census points in Colombia, and he looked at these 1 hectare plots, which he surveyed between May and June in 2015 and 2016, and he also did winter counts in 2015, and he had 4 counts per plot. So he walked this 100-meter line along the street, recorded all the birds he saw within 50 meters either side. And so he did these bird counts this way within these neighborhoods across the city of Columbia. And these are all counts in residential neighborhoods, not at particular birding hotspots and so on. And what he found were that he found a total estimate of 100 species, an average of about 10 species per count, and about 31 individuals per count. And the pictures below show the most common species he observed. So we saw he saw American robins, black-capped chickadees, cowbirds, chimney swifts, northern cardinals, European starlings, finches, mourning doves, house sparrows, and grackles. So again, the point we're trying to get across here is that he saw a wide range of species, over 100 species, and he saw a group of common species. So the key point in doing the systematic count is that he looked at common species, which were there, but he also found out a lot about the probably 30 or 40 species which are much less commonly observed in the city. Okay, another example of a systematic study actually is a different kind of study looking just at 2 neighborhoods in St. Louis. So these are neighborhoods in what's called North City, so it's north of Del Mar. Again, it's areas predominantly the African-American area of St. Louis. And the project looked at 2 different neighborhoods in North City, at Baden on the left, which is at the very northern tip of St. Louis City, and then Wells Goodfellow, which is on the sort of the northwest side of St. Louis City. Sebastian Moreno, who's the graduate student who did this work, is now a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts, and he was involved in a project looking at birds in neighborhoods where there's a lot of vacant land. So these are neighborhoods which have had a lot of housing abandonment. For example, Wells Goodfellow has had a decline, something like 40% of their population in 10 years, a lot of vacant property, lots of issues around vacant land management and so on. He was doing these counts in this neighborhood. And what he found, again, in these 100 plots, where there are 50 in each neighborhood, I lost a slide in here. So what the slide said was that there were 53 species in these neighborhoods, and that these 2 relatively small neighborhoods still had 53 bird species in here. And they ranged again from very common species, but also included dick thistles and red-winged blackbirds and other common species that you typically don't think of as being common in urban residential neighborhoods, which are tied in with a lot of these vacant lands. So the key points coming out of this, again, are that these systematic counts kind of support rare species, they support less common species, and they recognize that often where birders are going may not be the places where all the birds are in the city. So this raises a question about, if you're a birder, you want to contribute to community science, what kind of things might you consider? Well, the first thing to consider is think about what questions really matter to you, not just as a birder, but what do you want to know about your city? What are the places that really fascinate you about your city? And maybe think about what birds occur there. Think about, as a birder, how do you involve people where they live? In other words, how would you get your neighbors involved in birding, and what kind of place would they really want to look at? But also, what would they see around where they live? And then also think about the people who are not like you. What would you see around by where they live? The people who don't live in your neighborhood, what would they see? And then finally, what are the places that you've never been in Kansas City that maybe are a little bit scary? What are the places, the neighborhoods you wouldn't go to? The places you probably wouldn't want to see, the parks, the cemeteries, the places where you wouldn't go. Those are the kind of places that probably should be studied. So all those kinds of places and all those kinds of questions might make up a Kansas City-wide bird survey that might involve people from all over the city, that might engage people who've never been involved in a project like this before, but who know the birds right around their house. And that kind of project might be one that really would be an interesting look at Kansas City, an interesting look at birds, and a really exciting way of thinking about birds in Kansas City, and that might get a really interesting look at where those 330 or so species actually are, and where they might differ in their distribution. And that kind of project might be one that would really get a wide range of people in Kansas City excited about birding, engaged in birding, and really involved in thinking about those 4 counties in a really different way. Thank you for your attention. I apologize about the freaky things going on with my slides, and I will be glad to answer any questions you have.
That was wonderful, Professor Nilon. I love the idea of a citywide count that goes into areas outside the hotspots and just is a true count. I was surprised the number of species that are found in each county of 320 plus. That's like,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
That's...
Yeah, that was on the eBird list, and some of those, I think some of what's happening too is that a lot of those are things which people go out explicitly to see, and I think a lot of the sites on the eBird list represent the sort of rare species, especially the show eBird alert. For example, many people on Herbirders probably on their cell phone, they get the updates from mobirds.org, which used to be called Missouri Audubon Society, Missouri, and now it's called, I think, Mobirds. But that list reflects where there are a lot of accidental birds. So if you look on here today, I don't think it's on here yet. I was going to look, which I forgot to do. But if you look on here, you would see the list of whatever birds people are seeing, associated with the accidental birds, and they tell you where they are. So people are driving like to Big 11 Lake to see something that's there, or they're driving to like one of the cemeteries because somebody saw something there. So that's why you see a lot of those species.
In 2012 or 2013, there were snowy owls in Missouri, and I followed that and saw one up at Smithville Lake. So yeah. I love tracking those rare species that make their appearance in the Kansas City area.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And we have plenty of time for some questions. You'll see a Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Type them in there. Looks like we got several already. If you're on Facebook, type your question in the comment sections, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before noon. Chris has a question. When talking about systematic data, does that distinguish a professional or academic set of info versus community science?
Actually, no, it doesn't. That's a great question. It really doesn't. There's some great examples of bird counts that use volunteers and use community science, and that are essentially driven. They may be organized by somebody with a little more training, but they're actually done by volunteer groups. So for example, there's Ottawa Bird Count, which is done up in Ottawa, Canada, and that's done, and this was set up by some graduate students, but it's really been taken over by sort of local birding group there. And they assign people to locations to go, and they have people who volunteer to do certain sections of the city and to do points across the city and do the counts that way. There's a big tradition, especially in Europe. I think it's called Breeding Bird Atlas projects. I don't know. I know there's Missouri Breeding Bird Atlas, but I think some of these. I know in Italy there's a whole network of urban bird atlas projects, which are again done by volunteers. So they're done by people who are good birders, but who are interested in that project, and they set that up. There is a group of sort of ornithological societies which like Audubon, and they've done a lot of work on these. So you can find all kinds of guidelines about doing bird counts and a lot of different things. And one of the people on our, who did the project looking at all the bird data, works for essentially the Netherlands version of, I can't talk to you. Netherlands is a city by where I grew up in Colorado. Netherlands, the country, thank you. Netherlands, the country, who has done a lot of work as a volunteer. I think he was a teacher, but he's a really big birder, and he's really gotten involved in doing the systematic data collection. So yeah, to answer your question, the systematic studies are really just set up so people collect all birds collect data the same way at a set of places, and they're reporting their data.
Right. Maggie has a question about getting started. She writes, for a novice birder who doesn't know species well, do you recommend an app or field guide?
Yeah, a really good app. There's something called a Merlin app, which is which you can download on your phone, and that's actually done by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they have a bunch of they have the bird calls on it, and you can download those, and you can download the app, and you can set it up a variety of ways to get, species by region. They have what they call a library that's for different regions. I think they do it by state. Missouri Department of Conservation, I think, still does CD. They do just a DVD or a CD just for the state, and you can get that one at I know, like Burr Oak Woods and the Discovery Center. Those kind of places have them, so you can get those kinds of things pretty easily. And then also you can just buy field guides. I mean, I use a Peterson field guide, which is like probably more old school than some of the other birding guides, but they have nice pictures. You can look at them. There are all kinds of field guides you can use, and I think those just help you get out and just look. They're guides to birding for beginners, where they tell you just common birds around your house. And I think what really helps you getting started is to recognize that probably you could walk outside right now and identify probably 20 or so different birds already. And a lot of going birding is just kind of linking the names and all those kinds of things to what you already know. So you probably know quite a few already.
I go old school too with my field guide. I use a golden guide.
I have that one too. That's one of them, yeah.
And I don't think it's been revised for 20 years or so, but yep, that's exactly the edition I have.
Yes, I have this one. So
that's from the 70s or 80s, maybe.
Yeah, this is 70s, I think, or something like that. 70s or 80s. I think this is 80s probably. But yeah, I use these, and I know they changed the white color to the blue cover on here, and so I think that's the last big change they made. But yeah, these kind of things, and they're great. You can write in them, you can write on them, you can look, all kinds of things. So these are great.
And what I like about that guide is that it covers the entire U.S.
Exactly.
Not just, like Peterson, I don't know if they still do this, but it was a two-part book. They had Eastern North America and Western.
Yeah. And the other thing I would recommend is when you go places, most national parks, state parks, things, they have a lot of them have just a list of birds. And if you pick up that and then take this, you can get a pretty good idea what kind of birds occur different places. And, and you get those and you can have them at your feeder. I know my wife and I have sometimes we look out our window and to see what kind of birds we see, especially right now with the pandemic. It's a great activity. You can do it just outside your house when you go for a walk or something, and you'll be surprised how many different species you see.
That is true. We have a few questions related to becoming an eBirder.
Okay.
Can a novice beginning birder contribute to eBirder, or what's it take to become an eBirder?
Yeah. So eBirder, I think you just go to their website and sign up. It's eBird.com, I think. Either eBird.com or eBird.org, and you go there and you click on it and you can join. And then when you join in, you can add birds. You can also look up all their data. What they have that's kind of nice on it is you can type in everything by county, and then you can go to that. And like Wendy just clicked in, it's very easy to use. It's very user friendly. Another one, if you just sort of like outdoor things in general, one that's less specific to birds is iNaturalist. That's iNaturalist. It's the letter I, Naturalist. And that one's one that has a very similar setup. It's run through National Geographic and I think California Academy of Sciences. And that's another one that's very easy to use. I think Stacy just said they offer classes on using those. Hi, Stacy. So I know her. So that's somebody. But yeah, those things are all available. They're easy to use. And both those, I use iNaturalist for my class for people who usually are freshmen and often don't know a whole lot. And they identify, I think, like 300 species using iNaturalist this year.
And if you look in chat, everyone, the links to Merlin, eBird, and iNaturalist have been posted, and eBird. So again, so check that in chat for those links. All right, Stacy asked, do you have any suggestions for engaging underserved populations in these bird surveys?
Yeah. Okay, sure. Well, I think a couple things. One thing I think is just kind of engaging people sort of where they are, like when you're out birding, talk to people about what you're doing. I mean, one thing that we found was kind of interesting. I've had a couple students or projects with graduate students in St. Louis, had one in Columbia, and then had some in Baltimore. And I'll confess that I'm not a very good birder. So, I usually rely on my grad students, people who really have a lot of expertise. And my interest has always been a lot more in kind of the questions about ecology and management and conservation in cities. But one thing I've found is that birding something that can be very accessible to people, and it's also accessible because you're out doing something with your binoculars that attracts attention. And there's been a lot in the paper about birding while black and those kinds of things. But I think one thing that to keep in mind is that birding something that you have binoculars, you have field guides, you have all those things, and people often are interested in what you're doing. So I think talking about what you're doing, sharing that, explaining to people what you see. The picture we have with the picture I took, or it's taken with me and the kids in Franklin Square Middle School in Baltimore. They developed a whole program that one of the teachers who wasn't a birder just got interested in. So they take all the kids at their school, go to a nature center for a week up in northern part of Maryland. And they do kind of an outdoor school up there with all the kids in Baltimore. I think all the fourth graders go. So they had been out, so they had posters and they had field guides, they had all these different things. So I think just kind of reaching out to people and say, hey, talk about what's in your neighborhood, and I think just saying, we went with the kids at Franklin Square and said, okay, here are like the 10 different species we saw on the bird point that's right across the street from your school, which is just a straight, regular sort of inner city Baltimore neighborhood, like many neighbors in Kansas City. And we said, here are the 10 species we saw. Pretty much every time we go out, and people go, wow, there are those 10 different species. And we said, yeah, we saw, there's starlings and house sparrows and cardinals and there are mockingbirds, and here's what we saw and here's what they sound like. So that kind of thing. I think the other thing is I think a lot of people have found that projects in neighborhoods, like the project in St. Louis, which was part of a program called Green City Coalition, which is looking at different ways of managing vacant lots. And so talking about the kind of birds that you see around community gardens and in people's backyards and in vacant lands, and vacant lots and in parks really gets people interested in that.
Yeah, and once you start looking at birds and identifying them, then it's easy to get hooked. Then you see something a little unusual and you're like, well, what's that one? And then it starts. That's what happened with me, I know. Vivian writes, and she's in Southern New York.
Okay.
She's noticed much more bird action where she lives, especially hawks and woodpeckers. And she asked, have I just not been looking, or is there a connection with the pandemic? I misspoke. She's been seeing more bird action since the pandemic, and she was asking if there's a connection.
That's a really good point. And actually, there have been some papers published about it, and I think there are a combination of things. I think one thing is that I think when you're home, you see more. and you see more around your house, I think that probably is quieter outside. So you hear more things. I mean, I'll mention quickly, I have a colleague, Mitch Wiegman, who teaches ornithology at MU. And he had, when MU went online in March, as when the lockdown happened, we had to go teach online. He had his class, his ornithology class. They were trying to document first, that's what people saw around their houses, and also to document the migration, spring migration. And one of the things that he said was he was surprised at how many more species. Well, obviously you see more species because the students are in different places, but he was surprised at how much each student was seeing when they did that from their home versus what they said when they actually had to do it as an assignment when they were outside different places in Columbia as part of the assignment. And what he thinks, what I think is that you're more observant when you're home, you're looking more because you're outside more. It's not as noisy out, less traffic noise, that kind of thing, at least earlier in the year, when there's less traffic. So I think some of that is all part of it. So there may be birds moving around more because there's less noise, less human activity, but I think also people see more. So, but that's an excellent question, and I'm not sure the entire answer.
I hadn't thought about less noise and fewer people out.
I mean, but it's weird because like we had a pileated woodpecker in our backyard, which was, I think I've never seen it. It was just like in the backyard on the ground. So that was kind of interesting. And I'm sure I know they're around, but I'd never seen one in your house. So that was kind of interesting.
We've got a couple questions related to feeders and bird populations. One is, any suggestions on what people can do at home for supporting the local bird population?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think there are, well, first, there's some really, really good references available. I mean, I think in both states, when I worked in Kansas, Kansas had a backyard wildlife habitat guide kind of thing. And there's similar things with MDC does in Missouri. I know MU Extension, Bob Pierce, our extension specialist, has done some things for wildlife practices. I think that there are a range of things. I mean, the main things I think are having feeders, obviously, and the type of seed used for your feeder, having water sources, those kind of things are really important. But I think one thing that people often don't think about as much is just how you manage your yard. So things like, how often you mow your grass. If you have, say, maybe more native species in your yard than non-native species, those kinds of things all will have an impact. But I think just things like maybe trying to do more wildlife-friendly practices. So there are a list of species you can plant. There are a list of plant species you can plant. There are lists suggesting how you can manage your yard, how you can mow less frequently. So there are a range of things like that that really probably improve habitat for birds. And one thing I'll just mention quickly, we looked at when Eric Fischel did his master's in Columbia. One of the things that he looked at were people's yard management practices, and in terms of what he could actually see, but also what people said they did. And he found that there was a relationship between people who said they were trying to do more wildlife-friendly practices and what actually was in their yard in terms of vegetation, and what was and how the birds responded. I'll also say very quickly just that some things like lots of birds like non-native plants too, so things like honeysuckle and all that stuff, which are not particularly good plants to have in your yard and are an invasive. A lot of bird species like those. So what's good for birds may or may not necessarily be the best things to plant. I'll just mention that real quickly.
Do bird feeders cause dependency?
That's a question I'm going to say honestly, I don't know. I don't think that they do, in part because especially in the winter, because what birds are doing is they're flying around, and they're flying around to different places in neighborhoods, and there's a lot of literature about how sort of birds locate where they are. And so I think what happens is they sort of hit different places, different times of the year, and during the winter, and they're looking for food sort of all the time. And so I think that probably it certainly helps them to have bird feeders out, but I don't think if you quit feeding in the middle of the winter, the birds are gonna die. I think they'll find other places.
Is Kansas City, Missouri within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Urban Bird Treaty Program?
I'm not sure. I know St. Louis is. I'm sorry, I don't know about Kansas City. It may be. I don't know if any of the. I saw Stacy on. I don't know if she knows or not with Conservation Department, but Stacy may know. But I'm not sure if they are or not. For those of you who know, this is a program. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a program where they have urban bird treaties, which is where cities make a commitment to do certain bird management practices. They also have an urban. I'm sorry. They also have an urban bird. They have an urban refuge program with Fish and Wildlife Service refuges. So I know, like Big Muddy National Wildlife Refuge, the St. Louis side is a partner in that, and they may be in Kansas City as well. I'm not sure.
Stacy just posted in chat that I'm not aware of KC being in the urban bird treaty.
Yeah, yeah. These are both you can look them up on the web, and for the urban bird treaty, it basically says that the city agrees to do certain practices. And I know for the working in St. Louis, the people there said that St. Louis signed the treaty like 20 years ago and had never sort of been heard from since then. So, but I know they're active with the refuge program. So I think the city part, they hadn't been as engaged with, but the refuge part, definitely they've been working with the city on that. So.
All right, we have a question from Mary, who lives in Hartford, Connecticut. She's working to conserve and revitalize an urban riparian corridor. And she wants to know, based on your research, will birds of all species tend to congregate near water, lakes, and rivers, whatever their surrounding demographics?
I think that depends. That's a good question. I think that depends a lot on first what the species are. So, for example, there's some species which basically you won't find near riparian habitats at all. I think there are a set of species which you almost only find around riparian habitats. Then there'll be another group that probably will move through there. These are for migration. They may use, they may be there certain times of the year, that kind of thing. So I think that it depends a lot on the species in that region, and also on sort of like, is this, say, a large river corridor, for example, like if you look in Kansas, if you look, say, in Kansas City, you might think about, the sort of Missouri River bottoms, Kansas River. There are a lot of species in there because those are really large areas, but other places, and then places like Swope Park or along the Blue River, which again is a fairly large riparian corridor. So it probably depends on the size of the corridor, what species uses it. And a lot of species use it during migration. So for example, a lot of species, like of all the songbirds basically that migrate, a lot of those will use riparian areas as just sort of stopover points for maybe a day or two, things like that.
Right, and I forget who it was, but someone posted in chat a link to the Burroughs Audubon Society, the
Yes.
Greater Kansas City's Audubon group, and I know they are very active in the city and in the wider metro. And I would say there are Audubon societies in almost every small town up to large city as well. So we had a few questions about how to get engaged, locally with.
Exactly. Yeah, I think check a link. Just look up Audubon societies, and you'll find one. And they have programs. I mean, it's a great way to go out and get birding, just get some experience. They do a lot of programs. I know that in St. Louis, in Columbia, I know that Burroughs and Columbia Audubon both do a lot of. Well, they actually have sites and places you can go to. And there's Columbia Audubon Nature Sanctuary, and they do programs from there. And they have a place called Wild Haven, which is a sort of more natural area they manage. And Burroughs does similar things. They do a lot of programs. I think another really good place is if you're in a larger city, a lot of the nature centers do birding programs like Gorman Discovery Center in Kansas City, Riverlands Audubon Center up in the Kansas City area. There are all kinds of places. I'll mention one that when people talk about getting underserved communities, there's one really good example that you often don't think about are schools, local schools. So the Ferguson Florissant School District in St. Louis has a nature center that is right in the middle of, again, a fairly low income area in the city, but they have a nature center and the school district runs it and all the kids go there. They go to that school district. So there are lots and lots of ways you can get involved. And yeah.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. Professor, I saw you posted your email address in the chat.
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to. I sent it. I went to everybody. I don't know if you saw it. Did it go to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I put in my email, and feel free to email if you have any questions. And I'll send out to say that if you're on the Missouri side, Missouri Department of Conservation does a lot of different things at their nature centers and activity and offices. On the Kansas side, Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism does similar kind of things. So the Prairie Center, Burr Oak Woods, all those places, Discovery Center, all those places do a lot. Plus the city has a lot of different things. You know, Wyandotte County Lake and all these places have a lot of that things going on as well.
All right, let's end with this real quick question. What is the most unusual bird that you have seen?
Okay, the most unusual bird I've seen.
However you define unusual.
Well, I would say unusual. I would say I had a chance to go to South Africa a couple of years ago and actually saw it, not in city, just in Kruger National Park, whole range of things. So I will say the go away bird, because they say go away when this. I thought it was kind of cool. Their calls are like go away, and they're big and they have long tails, all this other stuff. So I thought that was pretty unusual.
That'd be
and in Missouri, painted bunnies, because I think painted bunnies are just really cool birds.
That's great stuff. Professor Nilon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk birds with us today and share your expertise and research. Let's not wait another, what was it, 39 years?
Well, in 39 years, I'll be a little bit older, so I don't know if
I'm right there with you. So I don't think we should wait that long again. So.
But thank you again. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Again, for future events at the Kansas City Public Library, visit kclibrary.org, and for upcoming events at the Linda Hall Library, go to lindahall.org. Thank you all for tuning in today and have a great rest of your day.